Broadcasting from the Hip Hop Weekly Studios, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Civic Cypher, where our mission is to foster allyship, empathy, and understanding. I am your host, Ramses Ja.
He is Ramses Ja. I am Q Ward. You are listening to Civic Cypher.
Indeed you are, and there's a lot to stick around for today, especially because today we're going to be talking about the intersection of faith and faith-based traditions. That's tough to say. The intersection of that and politics. And a lot of times what we're seeing is, and what we've seen throughout the history of this country, is that people will use religion, Christianity specifically, to justify their politics. And in doing so, they completely change the intention that most biblical scholars would assign to texts and narratives that they would assign to those passages. And so we need you to know about that and how to identify it and how to push back against it. And for the second part of the show, we're going to spend some time discussing an online exchange that was had where an individual effectively said that we should go back to Africa. There's more to the story, but we'll break it down when we get there. But there are people out there who really feel that way. They sincerely think that if you're not happy in this country, you should just go back to Africa. It's also simple to them, and maybe they're good people, maybe they're well intentioned, but the fact of the matter is that these people exist, and it's up to us to have these conversations for your benefit, so that if you encounter folks like this, you know how to approach them, and if you have a degree of empathy and they're willing to have a conversation, I think that bridges can be built in that space as well. So stay tuned for that and so much more on today's show. But first and foremost, like we always do at this time, let's discuss some Ebony Excellence.
Shall we?
We shall.
This week's Ebony Excellence is brought to you by Actively Black. Visit activelyblack.com. There is greatness in our DNA.
Facts.
From Humble, Texas, via KPRC. A 6-year-old boy in Texas may be one of the smartest kids in the state. In fact, he may be one of the smartest kids in the country. Chandler Hughes has joined Mensa, a society for people with high IQs. It's a special fraternity of people who are essentially geniuses. Chandler started reading before he was 2 years old and wants to be a doctor someday. Quote, a medical doctor, because I want to help people when they are sick, Chandler clarified. When he was in pre-K, Chandler's dad said his son finished on a 2nd grade reading and math level. He went straight to 1st grade. He completely skipped kindergarten.
Nice.
Chandler may be book smart, but his dad said the next step is to work on his socialization to help him continue to succeed in life. Young Chandler, you are not just ahead of where I was.
Ahead of your class.
In pre-K. But I think you are ahead of most of us who it's seeming to have this what I want to be when I grow up thing figured out already.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
So shouts to Chandler and his father for providing us with such an inspirational story. I think I want to be like Chandler when I grow up.
Sure. We do get an opportunity to cite an example of Black excellence. We call it Ebony Excellence on the show here, of course. But we do get to cite an example every week, just because our stories are not all doom and gloom and police killing us and everything bad happened and we're politically disenfranchised. There is excellence from our communities as well. And so today's example certainly feels like something that is more than worthy of that. And, a little Black genius child is never a bad thing.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're trying to change the narrative, right? Speaking of changing the narrative, Christ in politics. Why don't you start us off, Q?
Should I start with the video, or do you want to just hear how I feel about this thing?
Yeah, let's start with how you feel. You have a unique perspective here.
Well, I spent 6 days a week in church as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And then when school was out, I spent mornings, afternoons, and evenings in church on those 6 days. We did this thing called Vacation Bible School, revivals with other churches,
mm-hmm.
Baptist training unit, teachers meetings, ushers meetings, choir rehearsal. Yeah. I could go on and on. My mother was not just associate pastor, but before that a deaconess, and at the same time a trustee. So there was some function happening at our church every day.
Yeah.
but on average, 6 days a week, I was there. And, I know a lot about the Word of God, the King James Bible, most specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And Ramses said in our open that a lot of conservative right-wing politicians use the Bible to justify their politics. I think they use it more as a way to manipulate their constituents.
Okay.
Right? Because you have people like our former president, who we know is not a particularly decent human being, campaign on things that he knows will get a response from Christian evangelicals, mm-hmm. whether or not he believes it or not. You see a lot of claiming to be pro-life politicians that are actually just anti-abortion politicians, because they know that there's a particular section of our population, Christian evangelicals most specifically, that are very, very strong and very, very locked in on their position on that topic. So even if they don't believe it themselves, and most of their actions show that they are not indeed Christians by example, even if they belong to a church, even if they were baptized, even if they do tote a Bible, their actions show that the words and teachings of Christ are not something they subscribe to. They just understand by using certain points and certain speaking points and really certain political positions that they can get the right response at the polls from their constituency. It's not about holding up the tent poles of Christ and his teachings at all.
I remember hearing a quote. It might be from Gandhi, maybe. He says, I like your Christ. Gandhi is not a Christian, of course, was not a Christian when he was alive. He's from a whole different faith, but says, I like your Christ. I don't like your Christians. They are so unlike your Christ.
Wow.
Right. And that wasn't specifically speaking to politics per se, but I think that there are a lot of, I don't want to say there's a lot of Christians that identify as conservative, but there are a lot of conservatives that identify as Christians.
Indeed.
Right. And I think that particular facet, based on how they vote and the values that they espouse, and the values that they choose to espouse, because the fact is that you can cherry pick different things from the Bible and make yourself look like a decent person. But I think that really it's what you ignore, what you cast aside, that really shows your level of commitment. Mm-hmm. Again, the things you espouse can be sort of manipulated. The optics can be manipulated. And so I don't want to cast a negative light on, people trying to do their best. But what I think I want to do is illuminate the fact that not everybody really talks the talk, and a lot of people
talk the talk.
Well, not everybody walks the walk. That's what I meant to say.
The walk that seems to be missing right nowadays,
and there's a breakdown there. So, what brought this to our consciousness for this week is the video that Q mentioned. So let's play this video. This comes from a gentleman by the name of John Fugelsang, and this was on MSNBC recently. So go ahead.
Behind right-wing fundamentalists and Christian nationalists who use Jesus, whose birth we celebrate, as a prop while legislating and fighting against his actual teachings. There's a lot of right-wing brothers and sisters in this country who identify as Christian, and they care about the manger and the crucifix, and they ignore the 30 years of teaching. 33. Well, actually 3 years of teaching he did in between. Jesus is not an ally of the Republican Party. There is no overlap between Jesus and the policies of Donald Trump. In South Carolina, they tried to have a bill this year calling for the death penalty for abortion. We're so pro-life, we'll kill you. That's where we're at right now.
That's Stephen Wright. I would kill for a Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah.
Seeing the Pope this week enrage these right-wing Christians so much because he acted like Jesus in blessing gay unions.
Yep.
Jesus is not anti-immigrant. He commands people to welcome the stranger. He never mentions abortion. The Bible never condemns abortion. We've had 2 generations of Christians in this country who have been groomed to believe criminalizing abortion is something to do with what Jesus talked about. Christ was a peaceful, radical, nonviolent revolutionary, never mentioned gay people. He commanded you to pay your taxes, to welcome the stranger. Individuals and nations must care for the poor and sick in Matthew 25. He who lives by the sword must die by the sword, Luke 22. There's a reason why these right-wingers never try to put the Sermon on the Mount on walls in classrooms.
It's because somebody read the Bible.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm a child of an ex-nun.
Jesus' birthday, you're delivered.
Listen, I'm a child of an ex-nun and an ex-Franciscan.
Oh, wow.
And if you want to criminalize abortion and put people in jail because you're so Christian, when Jesus never mentioned abortion, but you support the death penalty, which Christ actually opposed, the rest of us...
A lot of men wrote the books,
But if you support those things, then the rest of us aren't obliged to take your claims of Christian piety seriously anymore. And the media is to blame because the media loves the bad guy and has made the Falwells and the Robertsons pass for what Christianity is for a generation. It's time to take the Bible back from the hypocrites and thugs.
Wow. So, you heard it. You heard it yourself. And I think that really stands up to what a lot of people have been pointing to. On our social media, we've pointed to a lot in the way of Republican hypocrisy. And we've identified and delineated lots of examples, Republicans, legislators voting to not fund school lunches, but to give themselves free lunches. You know what I mean? I believe that might have been in like Montana or Wyoming or someplace like that, maybe Idaho. Obviously, we've talked about abortion. We've talked about, all these other sorts of things. And there are people who can make arguments for, this was in the Old Testament, whatever, but Jesus was not in the Old Testament. Jesus was in the New Testament. So anything that people make arguments about, like homosexuality, those sorts of things, that's Old Testament. So in theory, the way that Christianity works is you have the Old Testament, and that serves as the Old Covenant, the old set of promises, the old set of rules, and then there's the New Testament. And the Old Testament informs the New Testament, but the New Testament is the one that you should go by. That is why you are a Christian. If you were just going by the Old Testament, you would be Jewish. And people try to use different parts of the Bible that conflict with other parts of the Bible, but they'll only take this one vantage point because it serves an agenda for them. It helps prop up their worldview. It creates value in their immediate universe, their frame of reference. And so, as you mentioned, or as the video mentioned, there's a lot of shortcomings there. There's some more that I want to take some time, and this first one I'm going to say, and I just want you to kind of figure out where this fits politically. Okay. There's a verse from Luke 10:9. Funnily enough, we're reading from the Bible on these radio stations, because not all stations, Anyway, this verse says, "Heal the sick who are there and tell them the kingdom of God has come near to you." So this goes against people who call universal health care socialism. Like it's a bad word.
That make socialism a pejorative term.
Yeah, like it's a bad word, right? But I'm reading from, often enough, those same people's Bible, right? And then they have to shift their argument somehow to say that it's not affordable, it's not sustainable, so forth and so on. And the truth is, we know that it is. We know that it is. This is the only country that is this developed that charges, like you can go bankrupt for getting sick. If the government is going to do anything, it's going to make sure that the health of the population is okay. Defend the borders.
Bankrupt from being sick or die from being poor.
There you go. There you go. Excellent. So again, this is from the same people's Bible, and asking them to reconcile that against their beliefs, they'll often have this kind of tactic where they kind of dodge the question or change the approach to the question. They'll shift it around. But if you are a Christian, as you profess to be, these people as they profess to be, you would imagine that these truths would be central to their moral compass, not, how much money is it, right? We already know in this country we have plenty of money. Everyone knows that. We're giving billions of dollars to fight wars that we don't even have nothing to do with, right? Let's move on. This time I'm going to read from Deuteronomy 15:7. If I'm not mistaken, Deuteronomy is Old Testament, but there are people who use the Old Testament too, right? So I'll do the same. If among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord God has given you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. All right, so remember we had this conversation, maybe it might have been 2 weeks ago, Q, where we were talking about how there was a war on drugs and not a war on poverty. Do you think that if Jesus was around, he would have supported a war on drugs or a war on poverty?
I think in the times of Christ, it would not have been framed that way in the first place.
It wouldn't even, yeah.
Right? He healed the sick.
There you go.
And would have treated a drug addict, someone who could not get off of their dependency on a drug to a point where the drug itself that was maybe designed to heal or help with some ailment was killing them.
Mm-hmm.
He would have treated that person like a sick person and wanted to help them.
Sure.
Not criminalize them or other them and put them in a position where their suffering at the hands of an addiction made them a horrible person.
Thank you. So there's
just my opinion. Though.
No,
I know.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's consistent with the person that we all know to be there, to be this figure. It's kind of the same as when Martin Luther King Jr. Day rolls around every year, and you'll see Republicans sharing quotes from Dr. King. And the rest of us know exactly what Dr. King stood for, but they're co-opting that image and selling it, rebranding it as some form of conservative values or whatever it is, and rebranding it to their followers and their supporters. And again, it's like rewriting the narrative. And this is something that's happened for Black people consistently. Elvis Presley is not the founder of rock and roll, and this is a story that tells as old as time in this country. But the powers that be, the folks that are in a position to rewrite the narrative and chronicle it in such a way that it supports an agenda that does not reflect a shared reality. That's something that happens, and we all need to know about this. Hence our discussion about how the Bible has historically been used, even going all the way back. Democrats are not exempt from condemnation here. The Bible, as many people may or may not know, was used to justify the atrocities of slavery against Black people.
And long before the institution of chattel slavery brought itself to this continent, religion in general, not just the King James Bible, has been used as a way to control and oppress those with less power, less resources, and less in the way to keep themselves from being manipulated by very often logical fallacies. You mentioned the red herring or the idea of just kind of changing the subject when brought to question on some of these very, very straightforward verses from the Bible. The straw man arguments that are used oftentimes in the debates that we let kind of open lies go, even when they happen in front of us on television with the microphone.
We all saw it.
Yeah. So it's, it's not just the Bible. It's not just Republicans. It's not just politicians, but speaking to Republicans in general, because they have kind of positioned themselves as the party of evangelical Christians in this country. So that's the reason why they're kind of being called to the carpet. Is because at the time they are using the Bible as a catapult to their political platform, even when it has, has very little to do with the teachings of Christ.
There's something else here too. Just like these folks are kind of reworking the angles of the Bible to suit an agenda, If I'm not mistaken, I believe this is true. The reason that the King James Bible exists in the first place is because uh, the original or the Bible that was widely used prior to the King James version um, prohibited divorce. And it might have been King James or another king or something like that. They wanted to get a divorce, and so they commissioned a new Bible to be written or translated, and to have that language massaged from the original. I think it might have been Hebrew text or something like that, to where it allowed for an interpretation that gave an access point for divorce.
Mhm.
And this isn't. I'm not just making that up. This is something that is factual. This is the basis of that version of the Bible. But the details might not be there, but the overarching kind of storyline does. That is factual. And so, just know that when people try to use these things kind of to stand on to kind of example their moral compass, even people that are really true to it and they use the text word for word, they're simply using a different person's interpretation of the original text. One person that I follow on TikTok, his name might be like Dan McClellan or something like that. If you follow me on TikTok, he's one of the people I follow. So that's the best I can give you right now. But check him out. He is a biblical scholar, just like the person we just listened to, John Fugelsang. He's a biblical scholar, and he interprets the Bible from the original text, and he gives historical context to what it is that people were doing and thinking and saying at the time. So he's a historian and a scholar and a person that has the original text information. And he is a fantastic TikToker to follow because he blows so much wide open because people only have an idea of what they think is happening. And this guy, as close as I've ever seen any human come to it, this guy actually knows full well, because again, he has context. He knows what these symbols represented and why these people talked about this certain type of bread in the body, all this sort of stuff. So one of the things that I want for us all to take away from this is that it is important to maintain what the founding fathers wanted in this country, which is a separation of church and state. But with that said, it is okay to have personal beliefs and for those personal beliefs to be reflected in your politics. But in theory, religion is something that brings out the best of us, causes us to fellowship more and to be more charitable and more empathetic and understanding. And what we've seen in recent years is that one party in particular in this country is actually using religion to drive an even further wedge between who we are to each other and how we relate to each other. And they're doing it in the name of Christ. And that feels very unfair.